You might be wondering, how does this game choose how many new positions we're going to play per session? It turns out it's 5. And so I've played, even as I narrate, 16 different, well, I played 16, there's 16 events or transactions. I think some of them are repeats, like the one about Joseph taking Jesus and Mary and going into recess in Egypt. That was repeated in the course of the 10-minute session. So again, 5 new positions. We have a feature, it's not visible in the UI, but it's called the fiat factor. It's just a percentage, actually. And I think in this case, if I were to go to IntelliJ, where the backend is, I can look at the configuration and maybe Bible Latin have some properties. And you if you're done watching, you don't have to watch this part. This is just extra. It's because it's already a long video, so feel free to bounce. But if you're still watching and you're curious, excuse me, the image and the music are configured here. And for some reason, the application is called Tacitus SRS or Tacitus Spaced Repetition System. The original intention was for the data that is used by the application to come from Tacitus. Because we have translations of the annals and histories and other texts by Tacitus that I had wanted to study at the time, but they're not highly parallel. You'll get one big chunk of text, maybe 10 or 12 sentences, and you get a whole English paragraph in parallel. So you have to do the extra work of lining it up sentence by sentence to really gamify it. The Bible, on the other hand, is already highly parallel between the Latin and the English. For the most part, every Latin book, chapter, verse, triple will match the same in the English. There are some minor alignment issues, I think, in Ecclesiastes and maybe in a few other books in the Old and New Testament, but they're pretty minor. So 99% of the time, you're going to have a perfect match. So if you have an HTML version of each corpus, then you can write a program that basically produces a TSV, tab separated values, or JSON for your raw data to be consumed by the application. It's not very hard. But anyway, application.properties. So what I see is that the fiat percent actually set to 40, which means that 40% of the exercises that we do and we play any session are up to that number going to be new. So what does this mean practically? I didn't say that, oh, play 5 new positions or 5 new exercises, like 5 unseen by me, versus in any given session for a chapter. It's just percentage based. So if I'm going faster, then I'm going to get the appropriate percentage of new information per session. And yeah, otherwise, for 60% of the time, the application is going to be selecting positions that are ready for review according to the space repetition system, which in this game is very similar to that suggested by Clozemaster's blog, that if you have 1 success, the position will be ready 24 hours from the latest success, 2 successes in a row, then 10 days, from the last success for that verse, and so on. It's the intervals increase. That's why it's a spaced repetition. It's spaced out in greater and greater intervals up into half a year or 180 days. So as I learn, I prefer to do, in this case, 60% review. I could change that fiat percent. I could reduce it to 20%, for example, and maybe benefit even more from just 80% review, slowing the introduction of new information into my brain. If you look at the code, there's also the feature that the sessions are limited to 10 minutes. I don't have to set a clock. If the method is called to basically start playing or just to play, it will detect, hey, I don't have a session ID. The session ID is also going to be a timestamp based on the current time. And you can see that basically it's saying that if the duration of the current session is greater than or equal to the 10 minutes, then we're done. We're going to be redirected to the screen shown at session end. We'll listen to Evan de Milner singing Gaudeamus, Igitur, Cetera, Iuvenestum Somos, and so on. So, yeah, right here, we're going to decide if we're actually going to do review. There are a few other things to consider. Obviously, we have to review in any given book if all the verses, all the chapter verse pairs have been played already. There are some minor considerations. And what I want to say is that the selection of new positions, yes, it's random, but we're only playing new positions 40% of the time. So I'm not just randomly playing all the time when I do these sessions. That would be kind of silly because it would be only fortuitous that we review the content. But if spaced repetition is our silver bullet or our miracle, then it pays to, check your ego at the door, so to speak, and just review. Any remarks to make on this kind of learning system and its postulates in opposition to traditional learning in the schools? Typically in a course at a school, every lecture is going to be totally new content with very little, maybe some connection to what you learned yesterday or the last week, especially at the university where, we can't consume too much of the professor's time. And so we can't have, more than 2 lectures a week or it's so-called discussions. So it's the rate of introduction of new information to be extremely high, probably too much. But the week of the midterm or the week of the final, what happens? The fiat factor will drop to 0. So great, you're going to consolidate the information that you're going to be tested on, at least some of it. But during those weeks, your brain isn't stimulated by new information. So maybe a little new information would help. It would build the skill that the course intends to teach. With language, I think we should be building the skill of speaking, the skill of reading, listening, whatever the fourth one is, and I guess writing, reading, speaking, listening, not to mention conversation as well. We should be building those skills so we don't have to think about them as we do them. If we think about them as we do them, then obviously we don't really have the skills. So skill implies some speed up in the doing of something. Back to the point, the traditional academic course also, it's only, 3 months, 4 months, not to mention a summer course, just 1 month. So if it's not 6 months or 7 months, then it's missing out on what? You're not going to be exposed to fourth impression or the fourth repetition of an exercise in a spaced repetition scheme. And I say 7 months because say you got to write a few times in a row, the interval between the third and the fourth repetition is going to be 6 months. So you need 7.5 months actually to really review and start that second wave. Maybe you could get that second wave of learning, the term I'm borrowing from Osimil, which also makes language courses, which are pretty good, but the volume of data is too little or too sparse compared to what we can make for ourselves from the internet. You can download the Bible in HTML, for example, for classical languages or ancient languages. For modern languages, you can download 30,000, 60,000 clips from Mozilla Common Voice for basically infinite dictation exercises. So you always have that element of review, say 80% versus 20% fiat factor in every session. So you have review and new exposure at all times. So your brain can never only partially solve a problem of transcription or just of building some linguistic practical skill in general. The brain is always forced by introduction to information to look towards the general solution of the problem rather than to freeze or harden into some partial heuristic. The long speech on this matter and on the fiat factor, but I'm hoping to cover a few points. What is the opposite of the fiat factor? Rate of review. Given that spaced repetition is some magical, miraculous thing, I exaggerate it. Justin Song, YouTube on Instagram, he's, I think, more of a skeptic at this point, and I'd like to review more of his content. But assuming for now that spaced repetition is our philosopher's stone, then it pays to really maximize review up until a point, because again, changing topics from Latin to German, it behooves us to maximize the number of positions we have in play. Say we download 60,000 clips from Mozilla, you do want to reach the point at which you've been exposed to 10,000 unique exercises. You're going to repeat those 10,000 as you go from 10,000 to 12,000. You still want to be repeating those 10,000 that you know or kind of know most of the time. And again, the point isn't to master any of the 10,000, but to respond with greater precision to the new 2,000 that you play between the time you have 10,000 positions and 12,000. So going back to this report in this biblical application, and interestingly, the point initially, because it's called Tacitus, was to study Roman Latin to make my own parallel texts from Perseus, the kind of daily ritual, but the Vulgate, the Catholic tradition, kind of took over. So as much as I pretend to be ironic about it, maybe it's not really that ironic. And here we go. We have 7,252 positions. I have a position, for a book, chapter, verse triple, if I've experienced it as a close exercise in this game. Financially, there are many stocks out there, for example, in the S&P 500 or the wider NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, but you don't have a position in any stock unless you've bought it and still hold it. It's a financial metaphor. The original buy of, for example, Microsoft, with a transaction. That's why I use the term transaction and position in this game. And surprised that anyone is still listening. I'm not sure if I am even going to listen to the remainder of this video. This concludes yet another episode of Use and Abuse of Catholic Tradition for the Learning of the Latin Language. Voila.